Would you say, in your opinion, that critical theory and elements of postmodernism, such as deconstruction, do not support the church?
Irredeemably so, yes. They do not support the church.
All right, so Hanna, you have put out a petition on change.org that is about bringing BYU back to being a Christ-centered, having a Christ-centered education. Why did you feel the need to do this?
When I first got to BYU, I was working as a research assistant in a faculty center. And during this time, I saw that there were ratings for a particular professor that talked about how she thought the family proclamation was wrong, and these students felt uncomfortable. Then I started thinking about the differences between BYU and other religious universities. I had attended a Catholic college for a year prior, and I had my own experiences with professors who would say that what I consider fundamental doctrines of the church, and I think what the church considers fundamental doctrines of the church, to be wrong. So then I had this in the back of my mind for the next 2 years, and then the honor code protest hit, and that really just ignited it. So it really started
we'll get
off
to that for sure.
As a family proclamation thing.
Okay. So was this something you found? Because I'm trying to track back a little bit when some of this kind of thing started. This was right when you got to BYU. You started experiencing this.
Yeah, it was within my first semester.
Okay, and that has continued since. I mean, you're now a graduate student. You've done your undergraduate at BYU, and this is something that has continued each year that you've been there.
Yeah, every single year, and I've heard more experiences from other people too.
What is the message sometimes that you're getting out there with the family proclamation?
There's a lot of different messages. I've gotten the message that if you're a woman, you should defy the roles that the family proclamation outlines. And I'm not saying that every woman needs to be a stay-at-home mother, but I've definitely had professors tell me when I express my desire to be a stay-at-home mother that it's a waste of talent or it's a waste of intellect. So definitely a lot of stuff personally about gender roles, and I've heard a lot of different professors say that to other students. With regards to sexuality and marriage, there's a twofold element there, right? Like, so there's the element that people will say that, the family proclamation could change. It's wrong right now. It's like the priesthood ban, and it'll change later on, and the church will repent of it. I've heard that a lot. And then the second fold that I've heard is gender is not eternal, and that you can choose your gender. Even though
where is the backing from that coming from? How I mean, people,
sure.
That's of course a newer idea, very much a newer idea in all of humanity. Where is the idea that is an eternal principle coming from?
The idea that gender is an eternal principle?
Yes. The idea that you can in eternity choose your gender.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm just guessing. I would say that it comes from gender theory. I'd say that people who study Foucault and Simone de Beauvoir would be looking at those theories and saying, hey, gender is a social construct as opposed to something that is eternally given to you. And that's where you have the element of choice. Because if it's something that's eternally given to you, then you can't choose it, obviously. So then you have to go to the realm that it is a societal construct. And that is the foundation of disagreeing with the family proclamation.
And of course, the obvious issue there is biology is one thing.
Definitely.
Of course, that idea is moving into science also. You see all the interesting things on Twitter and other places right now with a 2 + 2 = 5. Have you seen that?
Yeah. Yes, I have.
Yeah. It's like there's this idea that you have to thrust in a deconstruction of math and science and everything else to prove that there's no absolutes.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, everything has become relative because you have relativity in a system that does not believe in God. And I think in order to have true identity politics, to have true transgenderism be pervasive, you cannot have God at the center. And I think that's one of the critical parts of gender theory.
Would you say that now you go back to gender theory, but would you say in what you've either your own thoughts on this or maybe what you've gotten from talking to others, that critical theory and postmodernism are the foundation of these new ideas?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it all stems back from Marxism, right? This idea that you can deconstruct society and deconstruct the family in order to reconstruct a society that is more equitable, where equality equals equity. Equality equals equity, and that fallacious idea is the foundation of all other theories that I think we see promoted, especially in the humanities and social sciences.
Just of interest here, how have you heard Foucault or Derrida referenced in any of your courses?
Yes, I have.
How often?
Very often.
Very often.
Too often.
Okay, but
Foucault,
in
Derrida,
a
yeah.
positive way, in a teaching way, like this is what we're looking at, and this is how you need to look at what you're learning.
Yes, I've taken a number of theory-based
Interesting.
courses. Yeah, which classics doesn't do it because classics naturally doesn't have that much critical theory in it, but other humanities disciplines definitely do.
Okay.
Which
Yeah.
I find
And
disheartening.
for those that don't know, if you go back and look at Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and others, there's really, I mean, to me, as I look at them, and I'm certainly no expert on philosophy or literature, but it just seems to me that it's when you bring the critical theory from the early 20th century, and then you add on the postmodernists from the 60s and 70s, you get this, I mean, to go to Derrida specifically, you get this whole idea of deconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
And you start pulling apart the texts, and really what you're saying is you're pulling apart speech also. And saying that, going against, for example, Plato, right? And saying that there are no true forms and no true essence, and that everything is just your experience. And based especially on your identity, everybody has different truths, right?
Yeah.
And so these things have kind of been pulled together, and it's really a fascinating thing to watch how fast this it seems like a lot of us have been asleep on these topics, to see how pervasive this new ideology of critical theory has, and postmodernism has infiltrated the academy and gone through the universities. And you would think, and it probably has to some degree, BYU would kind of be a little bit immune to that, because there's so much of that ideology that is against the gospel, that you would think there would be a little bit more of a buffer zone there. But at the same time, if you have professors that are out learning and getting their undergraduate and especially their graduate degrees in other places, they come back and work at BYU, you're going to get a lot of that eventually at BYU as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And I would say that it's most pervasive in humanities and social sciences, for sure.
Have you seen an example of the Family Proclamation being criticized in class then?
Yes, I have.
And have you seen people stand up to that at all?
I have personally stood up for it, and then I've had a couple of friends who have, but I've been in classes where people will openly criticize the Family Proclamation with the professor, and very few people will say anything. And then after class, ironically, people will come up to me and be like, I really agreed with you, I just didn't want to say anything.
Right. And that's,
Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm going to bring this up if I've got it here. There was a recent poll that was done by the Cato Institute. It says a third of Americans say that they are personally worried about losing their jobs or missing out on career opportunities if they express their real political opinions. Americans in all walks of life have been publicly shamed, pressured into ritualistic apologies, or summarily fired. So, yeah, I mean, and especially if you're 18, 19 years old, you're not likely to stand up and say something on that. Now, a couple of things that I'm going to bring up about your petition here that you specifically said. This is, by the way, you and, let me get his name right here, Tristan Murier?
Yeah.
Okay. And am I right in saying he's the one that went to the protest and started reading the Family Proclamation?
That is him.
Okay. So I'll get to that in a minute too.
Good company I keep.
Yeah. Okay. I'll get to that in a second here. But you say here, we join with many others in asking that the university consider whether or not they fulfill the mission statement, which is to assist individuals in their quest for perfection and eternal life. Do you feel that BYU has started to miss the mark on that a little bit, that they're not fulfilling their mission statement?
I think to a degree they aren't. To the degree that they allow professors to say things that are contrary to what the gospel teaches, they aren't. I've had a lot of really good professors who I felt like did tell us how to live the gospel in a productive way. But I've also had experiences where professors would say openly that the family proclamation is wrong. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I will say on an administrative level, I do wish we saw a bit more gumption in supporting the church than we often do. I think that there can be a delay in time.
Support and from where? Gumption from where?
Office of President Worthen, and perhaps the Honor Code office too, and the communications office as well. I do think that they
pretty much the administration.
Pretty much the administration, yeah. I mean, I wrote a letter to them, so I'm okay saying that. I do think there's a lot of great parts about BYU. The Maxwell Institute also, I think, could use a bit of a revamping in terms of returning to old school apologetics that will strengthen the testimonies of individuals.
Okay. Alarm bells. Okay, yeah. I'll get to that in a second too. All right, here's more that you've got on the petition here. It says, moreover, even certain official actions taken by BYU have been out of accord with the clearly stated principles of the gospel to the point where the church has had to issue corrections. I'm guessing that you're talking about the gay issue.
Yes, we are.
Here. Okay. Will you go over that just in case some of the audience doesn't know about this?
Sure. So there are yearly honor code protests, not to sound sarcastic, but they're yearly honor code protests. But this year it was a bit different. So they issued a new honor code that had less prescriptive language. And then certain students went to the honor code office and they asked, hey, does this less prescriptive language mean that people who are gay can date on campus? The honor code office did say yes to that. We have recordings of them saying yes, actually. So they said yes to that, and then for the next 2 weeks, there was this.
You have recordings of that. They said yes to what?
To allowing gay students to date on campus. Tristan went in and recorded his conversation with an honor code office.
So this is in the honor code office, and they said that you're going to go ahead and have affection, for example, with same sex individuals.
Yes, and then
you can date and all that stuff, right? Like you would on almost every other campus.
Yeah, almost, except for some good Catholic ones.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so then the honor code office said that there needed to be a clarification, and then there was this 2-week limbo where nobody knew what was happening, and then the church commissioner issued a statement and said, no, the same standards still apply, it's just less prescriptive language. And then very large protests ensued where people came from all over Utah. And it started off as just saying that they wanted to keep the original honor code policy, but it turned into something much larger. It turned into protesting the church, and there were signs that said things like, if I go to hell, I'll see the Q-15 there too, or President Nelson and President Oak should die in a car crash. So it very quickly left the realm of saying, just we disagree with the honor code too. We completely disagree with the church.
You know, it's funny, I was having a discussion with one of my kids, and that's what I was going over when I first had heard about this. So I had this discussion with my daughter actually, and I said, okay, I can tell you something right now, that there is something more underlying this, and because there always is. It's never just the issue that is the invitation, so to speak. Right now, we might look at this kind of like we would see the current protests. I think if you look at the current protests, there's people out there with good intentions, and they're fighting for people they love, and they're supporting them, and there's an amount of empathy there. And then there's others that are up to absolute no good.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you need to clarify that. But I had said this is going to turn into something different by the time it's done, and sure enough, it did. Right. And it went from the protest there at BYU, and then they went to Salt Lake, right?
Yeah, they went to the church office. They went to the church office building in Salt Lake, and then they also went to New York Temple.
The New York Temple?
Yeah, they had a protest outside the New York Temple.
Okay, interesting. How many people in that protest were were students there at BYU?
Tristan told me that he thought it was probably half and half at best. He said that a lot of the people that he talked to were from Salt Lake, and being on Twitter, I saw a bunch of people who were not BYU students who just came to the protest from UVU or from Salt Lake or wherever.
Okay. So in my opinion, I think that people ought to be able to protest on those things if that's what they really feel, you know?
Yeah, definitely.
Were you there at the protests?
I did go to one of the protests, yes.
Okay. What are your thoughts about what you saw there?
My thoughts about what I saw there are a lot of disaffected people at BYU who I have seen mostly in humanities and social sciences. They tend to all major in sociology, not saying that the sociology department is bad, just saying that they tend to major in sociology or English or other humanities courses, other humanities disciplines, who basically have believed for a while that the family proclamation wasn't true. And they have held these beliefs for a while, and they found an opportunity to protest them. That was my experience. And they also seemed to be disgruntled with the church on a lot of different other issues. And to just not really want the church to stay the same and to quote unquote progress towards a more inclusive, quote unquote, inclusive atmosphere.
Okay. All right. Here's another thing that you said here in the petition. It says, we ask for an assessment of whether or not the university encourages courses, clubs, panels, conferences, events, and activities to align themselves with the Latter-day Saint religious values. Do you have something specific in mind there?
Yeah, this discussion for us mostly centered on identity politics. We believe that there are a lot of different instances where the university will host events that are for gay people. And I'm not saying that we don't need events for people who have same-sex attraction, but I'm saying assigning the identity of gay, I think, diminishes the identity that we have in Christ. Because we believe as a church, as stated in the Family Proclamation, that we have two identities, essentially, that we're divine children of a heavenly father and a heavenly mother, and that we have an eternal gender, male or female. And that this one even points back to our divine identity, right? Obviously, because there's heavenly father and heavenly mother. So we've seen a lot of events on campus that seem to encourage the lifestyle that goes along with the term gay, as opposed to saying that you have same-sex attraction. And just in courses too, we've seen a lot of courses that will use critical theory in a way that isn't critical of it, but it is praising it, promoting it to the point where it can't resemble the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Okay, so let me just go over a little bit of background for audience members here who don't know about critical theory. You know, critical theory basically comes from the Frankfurt School, from Germany. It was mostly Marxists who then tried to adapt that into a Western Marxism in the early 20th century. That seems to have kind of morphed in when you add in Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and others that are from the 60s and the 70s philosophers, and this idea of deconstruction and this idea of post-modernism. And you pull those together and you kind of end up with identity politics today that are kind of out of that fountain, or those fountains of those two ideologies as I see it.
Yeah.
And so you have, when you talk about gay, right, your one thing actually that you had mentioned is that identity is crucial. And so if we're identifying someone, say, for example, as gay or heterosexual or anything else, you know, there's a lot that you would kind of goes along with that. Mm-hmm. Instead of saying someone has a same-sex attraction, and I don't know what's best, you know, I don't know, I haven't studied that a lot, but it seems to me that when you say this person has same-sex attraction, you're not saying there's a complete identity there as you would if you use the term gay.
I agree with
maybe,
that.
You know, a lot of gay individuals want that identity. They want to bring that all on. But there's a lot that goes along with that is not just saying same-sex attraction. And so whether it's transgenderism, whether it's gay, bisexual, lesbian, etc., it seems like as we get to this idea of identity politics, you're throwing labels out there on people where it's almost like you're categorizing them separate from what you're saying, separate from
Exactly.
being a child of God, separate from an eternal gender.
Yeah, and if we're all truly one in Christ, we don't need other identities, right? Because I believe that we're all members of the body of Christ. And I think once we add on these other identities, I understand that the attempt of it is to give terminology to someone's experience, but I think it ends up segregating people. And I think it ends up creating divide and disunity because people will think that because someone is gay, they are different, or because someone is heterosexual, they are different. Or because someone is transgender, they are different. And I think those differences stem from identity being an important part of our society as opposed to action.
Okay. It's interesting you say that. There was, you've probably seen this, but Elder Bednar a couple years ago he was doing some type of a fireside, and he said something that seems very controversial. He said there are no gay members of the church. Yeah. And that can sound really ignorant, but when you listen to what he was saying, his point of view was exactly that. He was trying to say, we're all members of the church, and we're all children of God. And he didn't want to put that label on somebody. Have you seen that?
I have, yeah. I was really inspired by that. And I think it comes from a Hebrew Semitic idea too, that is really pervasive throughout the Bible.
What do you mean by that?
So Semitic language structure is very fascinating because it does not have this concept of identity. You are not something, you do something. So instead of you are a father, it would be you father. And that's the best way to explain it. So within the Bible, there isn't really this concept of external identities outside of God. You are attached to God, and what you do, yes, it can reflect on your attachment to God, but it isn't who you are. You are something because you belong to God. You are not something because you do something.
Okay. So where is the line on this? Because in my opinion, I would say that at a university, and I've taught my kids this, I want there to be a little bit of a liberal approach because I want that, and I don't mean that politically, I mean that in learning, right? I want there to be new ideas. I want there to be it's hard to learn if everything is just tightly, wound up and everything is exactly uniform and everything, basically what you end up with is regurgitation of everything. And so I think that's important. I think we need new ideas and I think we need people with different backgrounds. I think that's important. How do you balance that with staying with the doctrine of the church and supporting what the church says?
That's a really good question. And I've had a lot of personal experience with this. I'm writing a book on anti-Mormon literature. So I read anti-Mormon literature every single day.
Fun.
Yeah, I would say the best way to do it is you read everything. I think everyone should read the Communist Manifesto. I think that should be required reading alongside the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Paine's Common Sense. I think you should read everything that you get your hands off. I think no idea should be off limits, but I think the difference is the criticism that you apply to the idea. I do not think that you should promote ideas that are contradictory to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I think you should read about those ideas, understand these ideas, and explain the differences between the gospel and these ideas and confront them, not just merely accept them or praise them.
Would you say, in your opinion, that critical theory and elements of postmodernism such as deconstruction do not support the church?
Irredeemably so, yes. They do not support the church.
All right, moving on from your petition here. Where does BYU go from here on this?
That's a really good question. I think we need to have a dialogue as a university about what we consider to be out of hand for a professor to say. I don't want to dictate what the church would do, because the church is ultimately responsible for Brigham Young University. The Board of Trustees is the quorum of the 12 apostles in the First Presidency. So I think there needs to be a dialogue that takes place and an assessment of what is going on at the university to ensure whether or not we think it is acceptable for professors to openly say in class that the family proclamation is wrong. And if that is the case, then I think we need to change a bit of the mission statement of BYU. And if we decide to keep the mission statement the same and change the values to be more in line with the church, and that's fantastic. But I think Maxwell Institute needs some revamping. I think we need clearer standards.
Again, alarm bells there. Tell me what you mean by that, because that's something that, honestly, I can see this is where it applies to me.
Yeah.
Right. Because even though I'm not a student there anymore, like you are, and you're right in the middle of that, I'm not affiliated with Maxwell Institute, but I feel like I'm a student.
Yeah.
Right. Because I read so much from them and have pulled so much information from them and learned so much from them.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not the first person to tell me that.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a lot of people that have told me that. What's the issue there?
I think there are a couple different issues. First off, I'd like to say that I think the Maxwell Institute does do some great work. There are a lot of, I really do like the new theological introductions to the Book of Mormon. I think those are fantastic. There's a lot of good work that the Maxwell Institute does. But I think the Maxwell Institute has definitely taken a more secular lens, where not all of their work directly supports traditional views of the church and its doctrine, particularly with the Book of Abraham. I'm sure you've heard of a lot of the controversy that's gone on there, but there have been claims from members of the Maxwell Institute or former members of the Maxwell Institute within their scholarship and publicly too, that the Book of Abraham is not historical, that it's not authentic. And I think these claims can be problematic to apologetics of the church. And I actually just think they're untrue beyond their being problematic. But I think we need a return to old school apologetics within the Maxwell Institute that moves away from critical theory that I see preventing them. And I also think they do tend to hire people who are very outspoken against the church. They have a student in their employment who basically says that the family proclamation is wrong every chance that he gets. And I think that that's not a wise decision for a religious institution to make in conjunction to BYU and the church.
So here's what I've noticed on that. Again, I think some of my favorite scholars do a lot of work with Maxwell Institute.
My favorite scholar does a lot of work with Maxwell Institute too.
Yeah, and so it's like I want to support them, and they're doing a great job. But at the same time,
yeah,
you certainly see what you see with any other university department nationwide, right? I see all of these new terms, this new language that comes out, and whether it's on their podcast or whether it's in some of their publications, and their conferences that they have. It wasn't more than maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago when this started, but you start seeing those words, that go along with critical theory and postmodernism and deconstruction, and they're starting to go everywhere. And identity, right? I've seen conferences where students or graduate students that are closely affiliated with them, or they're standing up and they're talking about that they're excusing their white privilege, right? I've seen LDS scholars, very prominent LDS scholars, stand up and talk about how great postmodernism is. And there are some good things actually from postmodernism, right? It's not like the whole thing. It's kind of like anything. There's a little bit of good with a little bit of bad, or a lot of bad. And I don't see that changing. I don't. In fact, I think it's going to get worse. It just seems to me like if you're in that world of academia, that's for all the publications that you subscribe to, all of your professors from wherever you're from and wherever you were educated. They're all, it's extremely pervasive, especially in the humanities. And it's taking over science, it's taking over mathematics, it's engineering. I mean, you find it now everywhere. Dentistry, I've seen it in dentistry, and it's, so I don't know that I don't see how that turns around unless there is really a, board of directors really heavily get involved with it.
Something that I've thought for a while is I think BYU has become too concerned with being a world-class university. And I think there are elements to that are effective, where in the sense that if BYU is a world-class university, BYU can place a lot of good people in good programs and in good work environments. But I think at some point we have to recognize that Brigham Young University was never meant to be like any other university. This is supposed to be an education in Zion. And if we stop caring about what secular academia thinks about us and we start doing the work that would build the church and the kingdom, I think that's an eternally more profitable route than we are currently seeing in some places.
And so you're referencing mostly Maxwell Institute there, or all
Yeah,
of
mostly
BYU?
Maxwell Institute or humanities and social sciences. I would also include there too.
Yeah. Okay.
But we can leave out BYU Ancient Scripture and Religious Education. I think they do a pretty good job.
All right. So I wanted to get, you also put out an article, or somehow there's an article on Salt Lake Tribune. Was that an opinion piece you gave to them about the name
Which
of BYU?
one? Oh yeah, I did write that article. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a little bit of a movement now. It's to change the name of BYU, to take away the statues of Brigham Young.
Mm-hmm.
When I say the name, I mean Brigham Young University, because of some statements that he's made about race. How prevalent is that? How strong is that? And I know COVID has come in and kind of slowed all of this down. I mean, nobody's in town anymore.
Yeah.
Almost. So that's slowed everything down. But where do you see that sitting right now?
So this is going to sound weird, but I feel like Provo Twitter has some factions, and this is the best way to explain it. There is a progressive faction of students at BYU who would say we need to remove all the names, we need to take down the statues. And I'd actually say that faction is quite small. I think the vast majority of people agree that we need to keep the name of Brigham Young University and we need to keep the statues, and that despite what negative things Brigham did say, that he did a lot more good than he did bad, and he is of course a prophet. So I would say that it's a small percentage, but it's a very loud percentage, and because they're so loud they feel bigger than they actually are.
Okay. So not a huge issue.
I don't think it's a huge issue. I wrote the piece because it was in reaction to Tossie Young's piece.
Okay.
Yeah.
How pervasive would you say that critical theory and postmodernism is at BYU? I mean,
yeah.
I think I would guess, I just guess because I read a lot about this, but I would guess in the humanities it's extremely pervasive.
Yes.
And outside of that, it's somewhat pervasive. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think it's a mixed bag. My department, classics, doesn't really have a lot of critical theory in it. And there are definitely, especially members of psychology and sociology, members of that faculty who have reached out to me and said that they don't like teaching critical theory in their classes and that they're grateful for the petition. But there are a lot of professors in humanities and social sciences who do that. And I would say probably a sprinkling of professors in religion, but mostly centered in humanities and social sciences.
Have you ever had a religious professor say something about critical theory or postmodernism, deconstruction?
No, I avoid those classes.
That scares the you-know-what out of me. I mean, seriously. Yeah. I mean, if we ever get to a point where a Maxwell Institute or pervasively at BYU, where they're starting to go into critical theory with the scriptures.
Yeah,
because
that'd be scary.
That's happening at a lot of other religious institutes right now, right? I don't know if you saw with the Southern Baptists even.
Yeah.
Southern Baptists, one of the most conservative groups anywhere. They are now introducing critical theory into a way of reading the scriptures.
Yeah, I mean, I look at Tabernacles of Clay, that book that just came out, and I think that that's going to kind of set the tone for what some LDS theologians will want to do. And I think that that's really sad that we're starting to see.
Do you know how well that's been accepted?
Tabernacles of Clay?
Yeah, how well is it sold, do you know?
I think it's sold quite well, actually.
It has, okay.
Yeah, I think it's sold.
Academic circles, or?
It depends on your circle. I would say that there's a small group of people in the BYU circle who adore it, but mostly anti-Mormons, ex-Mormons like it,
Sure.
or progressive and name-only Mormons.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And what about in the administration at BYU?
I have no about critical theory in the administration.
Yes.
Yeah, I think there are instances of critical theory of individuals in the administration believing that critical theory and attaching more identities to people is the way to solve problems on campus. Definitely. So
without a change right now, you see that being more pervasive on campus.
I do, because the administration is they're the ones who approve conferences and panels and events, and they've had numerous events that center identity discussions. The process for getting these approved, you have to go through the administration. You can't just do it on your own. You can't just do it through a department. So I definitely think there is at least secondhand evidence, at least like second circle evidence, I don't know, of administration being sensitive or supportive of critical theory.
Okay. What can you tell me about gender studies at BYU?
Oh, yeah, this is really interesting. My roommate's actually a
How long
gender
has that
studies
been
minor.
around, by the way? A lot of people
Gender
probably
st-
don't know that that's there at BYU.
yeah, I would have to wager less than 10 years. It has to be fairly new.
Yeah.
Um, from what I've heard from my roommate, gender studies is a really mixed bag. You have some people who do it in a church-sponsored way where you can still have an element of gender roles and you can still have an element of gender identity, which that would be very hard to do in that current field. But then there are definitely instances where the professors seem to love Marxism and gender theory, and they think that these things should guide academics completely. And we'll talk about the deconstruction of the family as if that's a good thing, and the deconstruction of gender roles as if that's a good thing, beyond obviously the necessary cultural deconstruction that we need to do that's wrong. Just going beyond that mark into the doctrinal differences between our church and secular academia.
Yeah. That's
Yeah. Interesting
that's
stuff. I
concerning.
wish
I
we
mean,
didn't
I'm
have
not,
it,
again,
but
I'm not that I don't care much about left and right politics,
yeah, neither do
but
I. I'm libertarian.
I do care about the extremes.
Same.
And I'll fight pretty hard against either one of them, right? On either side
Yeah.
of it. And this is just really a very concerning trend that this neo-Marxist critical theory, postmodern deconstruction foundation and ideology that is so anti-family. It is so anti-family, and those that there's no apology from those that started these movements, these philosophers and political scientists that started these. They're all anti-family,
Yeah.
and everything sprouts out from that. It's just so obvious, and people need to know that when you hear things that are coming up from about critical theory. If you're a student, learn about these people, learn
Mm-hmm.
about the Frankfurt School, learn about Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, learn about their lives and where these ideas have sprouted from. And it's no wonder that the Proclamation on the Family is dead center on the attacks from this,
Definitely.
because the ideology is definitely against it.
Yeah, Marxism says that the root of all inequality stems from the family. So if you have the root of all inequality stemming from the family becomes the number one thing that you need to deconstruct in order to construct equality. And in this case, they would define equality as equity. So all of these philosophies, however much good you could garner from them, from certain aspects of them, are rooted in this idea that you can deconstruct things like family, you can deconstruct things like gender and sexuality, and you can push boundaries to the point where pedophilia is acceptable, to the point where children are schooled together apart from their families, and there isn't this idea of stability or two people being in union with one another, because all marriage is prostitution, according to Karl Marx.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's an oppressive hierarchy, very patriarchal, which is what Derrida says also. And he goes into
Yeah.
logocentrism. It's all about the patriarchy and masculinity. And of course, Derrida and Foucault were both signed on to the French Proclamation that wanted to get rid of the age of consent.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like 15 years old isn't young enough. Let's completely get rid of the age of consent so that an 8-year-old can consent to sex.
Yeah.
Is
Interestingly
what they
enough,
believed in.
they their contemporaries also supported this. It wasn't just them. Like if you look at Simone de Beauvoir, she supports them, and she says explicitly that she felt like the age of consent should be removed too. So it's not just a matter of a couple people within the ideology, it's a matter of the ideology.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And unfortunately, it has been very strongly adapted in now not only the academy, but I mean it's in our media everywhere. It's in government, and now it's starting to move into big business. So
definitely.
What was I'm trying to think of the big protest in New York 12 years ago. What was Wall Street?
Wall
Occupy,
Street, yeah. Occupy Wall
right.
Street, yeah.
Occupy Wall Street. This is not your grandma's Occupy Wall Street anymore because all these large companies are getting on board
Oh, definitely.
with critical theory. Well, listen, is there anything else that you wanted to cover? I had a question for you about you focused your study is on Greek and Latin,
Yeah.
is that right?
Yeah, I do Greek and Latin,
So
and
have
I'm
you looked at
doing
all or
Hebrew.
studied at all the word pistis for faith?
I have studied it a bit, probably not as much as you have.
Well, I haven't studied that much, but I just had a question for you because faith is
Sure.
the concept of faith is really important to me.
Hmm.
And for me, I look at it specifically as trust, right? Fidere.
Yeah,
It comes from fidere. And it's interesting. I ran a word search in the Old and New Testament. So you've got the Hebrew and then you've got the Greek, right?
hmm
And if you run the two words faith and trust, trust overwhelms faith drastically in the Old Testament,
definitely.
right? You get the word trust everywhere, and all of a sudden this word faith is gone almost. And then when you go to the New Testament, it's the reverse. It's not quite as high of a discrepancy, but it's mostly faith and then a little bit of trust. The word trust that's in there, and so it seems to me that and there's a few different words for trust and a few different words for
Yeah.
faith in Hebrew as well. But it just seems to me that there is a change from the original language as to how that moved into the English from the Latin and how we don't as much identify faith with trust. What are your thoughts on that? Would you say pistis is trust?
I would say pistis is trust, and I think we can think about this in framework of covenantal relationships, right? Because in the Hebrew Bible, you have such a large, or Old Testament, whatever you want to call it,
Mhm.
have such a large emphasis on the covenant between God and Israel, right? God and the people of Israel. So that covenantal language renders it more effective to say that you trust in something as opposed to you have this concept of faith, which seems amorphous for the average Jewish believer, because for them, faith was entirely relational. And then this is totally a Hanna theory. So this could be completely wrong. But I think within the New Testament, when we talk about the plain and precious things that were lost, we often are talking about ordinances and covenants, right? And that's why we had the Book of Mormon and then Doctrine and Covenants, because they restored the ordinances and covenantal language that is necessary. So within the New Testament, you have this concept of faith that is not completely borne out, because it does really still mean trust, and it is supposed to emphasize the new covenantal relationship that you have with Christ that mirrors the covenantal relationship between God and the people of Israel. But at the same time, the ordinances and covenants were beginning to be lost as early as first century. Like we see evidence of Paul grappling with trying to understand what he should and should not do, which I think is evidence for the fact that ordinances and covenants were lost pretty early on. So you see this removal of relationships, I think, in large part from the New Testament, not to the degree where it's unnecessary, like where it's not borne out within the New Testament, but it's just not as pervasive as it is within the Hebrew Bible, and that's why the Book of Mormon restores it.
Well, of
So
course,
that's
after
yeah,
70 AD, you don't have the temple anymore.
exactly. Yeah, you
So
don't have
going
the
into
temple anymore.
the covenants,
Yeah,
it's you don't have that center where you're going through those things.
yeah. So then faith has to become less relational and more of a concept, which leads you to apostasy when you see faith not as the concept. But I do find the word faith really interesting, pistis, really interesting, because I think we construe it as something that we have because of the way that it's written in the New Testament, not a relationship that we form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's of course what trust would be.
Yeah, and
Right,
that's
trust
why.
would be right at
Yeah,
the center of the relationship. That's what it is.
exactly.
Anyway, I go over that over and over again because that's just something that I've learned that I've experienced, and if you look at it as faith as trust and not belief, because sometimes pistis is translated as belief
Yeah,
in the New Testament, and there are a couple other options there too, but a lot of times you'll see belief, and it's the same word pistis or variation of it that is used for faith. And faith, again, fidere means trust.
hmm
That's where the word comes from. And anyway, plain and precious things. There's something else that might be plain and precious that's lost a little bit from translation as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because we're pisteuo, right? Like that's the Greek word that means like I believe in or I trust in. It's not when they say that I believe in, it's not this mere belief that they like hold within their mind and in their hearts. It's more of a description of the relationship between them and God. So I think that that connotation is often lost when
Hmm.
we talk about belief and when we talk about faith and trust, because really all of the words, to at least in my understanding, seem to point back to that covenantal relationship that you form.
Overall, now that you've got this affiliation with Fair Mormon,
Yeah.
where would you say that LDS apologetics is at right now?
I think all LDS apologetics is kind of going through a crisis, actually. I think you have disparate groups, right? Because you have Fair Mormon and I would say the Interpreter Foundation, which are a bit more traditional, but then you also have organizations like Faith Matters and Sunstone that are more progressive, and you're seeing this really big divide between groups of LDS apologists, like they call some of them. I'm not considered a neo-apologist, but they call some people who are about my age neo-apologists because they reject the historicity of the Book of Abraham and the Book of Mormon, and they'll say that Joseph Smith was a prophet who wrote inspired fiction. So we're seeing a crisis within apologetics that I
Where
think,
is that mostly at?
yeah,
Because I haven't seen that as much. I mean, the Book of Abraham, yes, but I have friends that believe that, honestly,
sure,
right?
yeah, same
That
here,
where
and they're good
where
people, yeah.
where where are those people? Where are those voices at?
A lot of them are independent voices. A lot of them, I would say, would be associated with Faith Matters. Would be the place that I would look for them.
Okay, that the
Yeah,
Book of Mormon is not historic.
yeah, that is becoming a more pervasive belief. Dallin Oaks has a really good address on it that you can find in BYU Religious Studies Center.
Okay, yeah, I'll look for that.
Yeah,
That's good. So you think it's in a bit of a crisis right now, and
I
it's
do.
is it the same thing we're talking about as at BYU?
I honestly think so. I think you have groups of people who are looking to apply purely secular standards to spiritual texts. And when you do that, then you will come up with a different result than when you acknowledge that when you're doing religious apologetics, not that your scholarship should be disingenuous, but you should also acknowledge the nature of the text demands that you see it in a different way than you see a historical text.
Which is so odd because
Yeah,
it's a paradox because the exact training that you get to do that with also says that there really is no truth to that, right?
exactly.
It says that there's different ways to look at the truth, and there are different truths, and yet they end up with a truth,
Exactly.
right? Something different, and that's the problem with it. There's no way, like with deconstruction, you can deconstruct everything, but something is going to fill the void. Something will always fill that void. And even though you're trying to get rid of an absolute truth, an eternal truth, which is really what deconstruction is, it's you can't do it. It's just against the laws of nature, of physics, of humanity, whatever. There's always something that is going to fill in the void because we all have values and we all have a values hierarchy, right? That we're
Exactly.
going to put into place. And so it always fills that void. The secularism that you see there, I think that there's this the same idea, right? You get this really good stuff and this really bad stuff that come in together.
Yeah.
And like I love where Maxwell Institute is in a lot of places, in a lot of
Same.
ways, because there's the training, the trained theologians, so to speak, or the trained scholars that are bringing a lot of this information. And they do a fabulous job, and in bringing in some ways of looking at things. And I'm thinking particularly of one scholar who I will not name that is one of my favorite scholars.
Yeah.
And yet, when it comes down to what's most important about what his interpretation is and what he's looking at it, which is Christ, it's not there. It's not there. And it's so frustrating to me that, I think there's a brilliant mind here, and yet it's not at the heart of it. It's the most important thing isn't there, and is not placed up at the top. and that's, I don't know, that's what we're all going to have to start dealing with a little bit, is trying to
Yeah.
sift through the good and the bad.
I think with that too, like two of my favorite scholars, I'll just name them, John Gee and Thomas Wayment, are affiliated with the Maxwell Institute, and I really respect the work that they do. I think in large part my criticism of the Maxwell Institute would be my criticism of a lot of apologetics generally, which is what you mentioned about Christ being removed from it. Because I think oftentimes when we engage in trying to prove or disprove truth claims about the church, or claims that anti-Mormons make about us, we move too far into a secular sphere because we want to show empirically that we are 100% correct. We want to use logic and reasoning, which I think we should use, and I think those are important. But we sometimes do it at the expense of the nature of religion. And we're in this environment now where we don't acknowledge that as a valid warrant to have. As you said, everyone has perspectives and everyone has biases. But, in the 15 and 1600s, it was a valid warrant to work off of the presupposition that God is real and that he is a living person. That was an accepted warrant amongst scholarship, right? Because the college and university system in a Western context was founded for the purpose of studying theology and studying classics. So I think we've undergone this societal change where those warrants have been replaced by warrants that we just can't accept. And if we try to use those particular warrants to analyze texts and to interpret religion, we'll come up with something completely different and divorced from the truth.
Yeah, I have kind of a system that I use for study, and I have these four interpreters, I call them, and then I've got what I call these Cwic principles. And two of those interpreters, one is what I call the Nehor principle. And basically what it is it's removing Christ to some degree or completely, right? Yeah. And you can go through history with the Old Testament, especially with the Book of Mormon, and then going into Paul, especially in the New Testament, and it's just over and over again. I think if you're reading under the text, so to speak, you're going to see this continual move away from Christ. It's like what we're studying now with Come Follow Me.
Yeah.
Right? It's like everybody that dissents from the Nephites, all of them are anti-Christ, so to speak. Every single group that moves over to the other side politically is no longer Christian. Right? And so there's always a constant move. To me, there is a natural decay in that doctrine that you have to hold up. And the another one of these principles that are interpreters that I talk about is the higher and lower law. And so exactly what you were saying in looking at things from a secular position, that's the lower law. It's important, right? It's physical things, it's observation, it's the scientific method. And it's very important, and you need it. But when you go back and you think about the historicity of the Book of Mormon, and you start going to that secular area, that lower law, where you're looking at, well, how is this done? Did he see every word on the stone? Did he look at it in a hat? Did he ever use the Urim and Thummim? How is the scribe taking all this information down? Did they ever see anything? That's all interesting and it's important. But as soon as you lower yourself down into that area, you're going to lose what's most important.
Definitely.
And which is, you know them by their fruits, right? You're going to know from the book itself, and in reading that, I say the same thing about the Book of Abraham, right? And I'm no expert at that, and I've read quite a bit about it and its production and what different theories, and there's not much known, but the book is real, right? The book is real, and the book is inspired, and the principles to me as I study it are pretty incredible. But you can't let yourself get down into which is sometimes the fun stuff, right?
Yeah.
Getting down into those areas, and it is fun, but it's not. It's a little dangerous. So it's a little bit dangerous to move down there. So
I agree, because we're talking about texts that were written thousands of years ago, that were recorded thousands of years ago, that we don't have the original copies of, that we don't understand things about the transmission, that the archaeology hasn't been uncovered, or lots of it has been destroyed. So you're never going to be able to completely prove a book And I think that's a fallacious way of thinking, is people will ask, if the Book of Mormon is true, why don't we have coins? And these questions are important to ask to a degree, but you can never truly prove the historicity of any ancient text because it just falls short. So what are you left to use to prove the historicity of a text? Well, the answer would have to be testimony, and seeing testimony as a valid confirmation takes a lot of intellectual rigor, right? You have to basically backtrack on David Hume's On Miracles, and you have to talk about the difference between testimony and confirmation bias and all that stuff. But I think that that's an important facet of apologetics that we sometimes miss out on. And I think that might be the most important facet, actually.
I would say also in between that, because I think that is the highest, call it a different level of knowledge, is the spiritual knowledge. But in the middle of that also has to do with like Alma 32, right?
Definitely, yeah.
I've tested this, I've used faith, because I believe that faith needs to be proved. I believe in evidence.
Oh, definitely, same.
I believe faith is 100% evidence-based. I just don't think it's physical evidence.
Evidence, yeah.
Right? And so it's like, I can read the text and I can try this out. I could try out the principles of the gospel and work with them, and I can see what happens to my life, right? When I apply the principles. See, those are real things. And to me, again, going back to faith, they're unseen things, but they're real. They're as real as anything. And so to me, as I read the Book of Mormon, as I read the Book of Abraham, and I go through what the lessons that are gleaned there are, and apply them to my life, right? That's a proof, and it's a lot stronger than finding some relic in Guatemala or Ohio that has the word Nephi on it. So
exactly, yeah, I totally agree, because the whole point of having faith is for Christ to change you into a different person and for you to enter into sacred relationships that are sanctified by his atonement. And if we forget that that's the point, and we think that the point is finding finding something with Nephi's name on it, if we think that that's the point, then we're missing out on the highest law. And I do think evidence is still important, definitely. Yeah.
But before we end, plug for your podcast. Tell us a little bit about that.
Awesome. So I host the Fair Voice podcast on Fair Mormon. We started up a couple weeks ago. It's super fun. We do apologetics. We talk about how to be an apologist. We do interviews with various scholars. We've done an interview with John Gee. We've done an interview with Spencer Marsh. Should be a really good time. One of the cooler segments that we do is we do responses. So we do responses to anti-Mormon literature, and we do responses to pieces of scholarship that we don't necessarily think is anti, but we just think is incorrect. We have Come Follow Me segments, just a ton of stuff. And if you want to be on the podcast or have anything that you think would be podcast worthy or questions that you want to ask me, you can email hseariac@fairmormon.org.
Okay, and I'll put that description there, that address down in the comments of this episode. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
And going over this with us. I think that people will be very happy with what they hear.
Awesome. Thank you so much.